Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Bradley Stein. He is a senior scientist at the RAND Corporation and adjunct associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh. A practicing child and adolescent psychiatrist, Dr. Stein has extensive experience in examining the implementation of mental health interventions in schools and other child-serving settings with a focus on school responses to trauma and violence. He served as a humanitarian aid worker in Romania, Croatia, and Bosnia during the 1990s, and in subsequent years has been involved in schools' mental health response to a range of national and international disasters and crises. A national leader in examining the implementation of mental health interventions in schools, Dr. Stein was one of the original leaders of an academic community partnership with the Los Angeles Unified School District that developed, implemented, evaluated, and disseminated CBITS, an effective school-based intervention for children exposed to violence. Dr. Stein was PI on a federally funded study examining the implementation of a school-based suicide prevention program and was a co-investigator in a federally funded project to create SSET, a modification of CBITS for use by non-clinical school professionals. He's currently leading a team evaluating the California Mental Health Services Administration Student Mental Health Prevention and Early Intervention Initiative, and recently led several federal projects to develop strategies to enhance the sustainable implementation of effective school-based interventions. I'd like to welcome Dr. Stein.
I'm so glad to be here with you this morning, and it's kind of hard following such wonderful talks. So I will do my best. You're going to hear some of the things I'm going to touch on are going to certainly reflect things that you've already heard, but I think what I'm going to do during today's talk is try to sort of take a step back and also sort of take this 20,000 or 30,000 foot level and really talk about sort of conceptually what is a model, what is a framework to allow us to think about what a trauma-informed school is. We've heard about lots of programs, we've heard about lots of interventions, we've heard about lots of specifics. So I want to take a step back and think about what are some of the foundation principles, how does this sort of look as being implemented. I'm going to draw on work that a lot of my colleagues from the Treatment Services Adaptation Center, we're part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and have been federally funded for over a decade now to help schools better meet the needs of kids exposed to trauma and violence. And so I'm going to certainly draw on work that a lot of my colleagues and collaborators across the country are doing. I'm going to try to be a little bit more hopeful, because while there are certainly challenges, and I agree with Sue that this is a wicked problem, I do think we can look at examples across the country of ways that people have been effective in trying to address this. And so at the end, I want to sort of lay out what are some of those specific pieces where I do think we have made progress, so that we can think about, okay, as we think about this model and we think about where these programs fit within this model, what are some specifics we can do? So I will go quickly. I'm hopeful that I'll leave time at the end for questions. One of the questions I would actually like to start out with that would be helpful for me is looking at this audience. I'm wondering, just by a show of hands, how many of you sort of identify yourselves as clinicians? Okay. How many of you identify yourself as sort of educators or educational administrators? Individuals who identify yourself as sort of being part of the child welfare, child protective system? Okay, and I know we've, so we have a nice mix here. And I will sort of try to touch on all of these things, but my focus today really is going to be about schools. So during today's talk, I'm going to be moving quickly. Some of these things you will have heard about. So I'm not going to go into some of the detail, but I'm going to talk about certainly some of trauma and its effects on students, why I think it matters in schools, and why I think schools have a critical place to play in helping to meet children's needs who've been exposed to trauma and violence. When we talk about trauma-informed schools, what do we mean by that? And again, we've talked about programs, but again, I'm going to try to put a framework around this that all of these talks that we've heard today really may fit within, and really some additional considerations that I think as this work moves forward that we really need to be attentive to. So first, trauma and its effects on students. First of all, let's not kid ourselves. A startling number of students are exposed to trauma and violence. This is from one study a number of years ago, but there have been any number of other studies. As you go from different types of exposure to traumatic events, you will see increasing numbers of students report having been exposed to different types of traumatic events that may lead to the types of sequelae that we've been talking about here today. And certainly, if we look at some of our most socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, some of our urban communities, this exposure to violence really approaches 100%. Right? So this is not one or two children. For some schools, this is a normative experience. This is as much a part of their day as reading and writing and arithmetic. Okay. What is childhood trauma? Let me share with you some definitions. And again, you've heard people talk about this before, but people sort of apply all kinds of different lenses to it. When I'm going to talk today, I'm going to talk about trauma being a type of inescapable stressful event. And there can be many types of a stressful event that really individuals the coping mechanisms of that student and their support system. Because I think it's important to recognize that many students are exposed to these events, but are resilient in the face of events that would personally have me crawling and hiding under the table. There's incredible resilience in our children, and I think it's important that we emphasize that. And this can be a range of different types of events. It can be both being threatened yourself or perceiving you're being threatened yourself, as well as witnessing or perceiving someone else being threatened. It doesn't necessarily have to be directed to you. And so I think about when we think about exposure, this really does expand it so it's not just the child's own individual experience, but really having an opportunity to see others around them, friends, peers, loved ones, being exposed to these types of events. You know, the emotional impact of exposure to these types of trauma can be profound. And oftentimes when I think trauma, people's minds immediately go to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, right? That's trauma, PTSD, and there's sort of that pathway. But I think it's critically important that we remember that for many children, the impact of trauma psychologically can go well beyond that. They can experience relationship problems with their friends and family. They can develop an entire range of emotional behavioral problems. They can perform worse in school. And so why does trauma matter in school? Let's dig into this. You heard yesterday people talking about what we've been learning about the biology. But bottom line, and this is a wonderful book for those of you who are not familiar with it, but over the past decade, neuroscientists have determined that exposure to stress, exposure to trauma in childhood, leads to physiological and neurological adaptations in children. These are permanent biological changes that affect their minds and bodies, develop, and affect the way they function in school. There is the mind-body connection that we hear about, and increasingly we're learning that this happens at the level of the cell. It happens at the level of the neural pathway. It happens at the level of the gene. There's a reason why children who've been exposed to trauma have a difficult time concentrating in school. We've talked about PTSD, but again, for children who are undergoing some of these changes, it puts them at risk for a variety of other emotional and behavioral problems. Substance misuse, aggression and explosive outbursts, depression. It's more than just PTSD. We're talking a range of problems that obviously can begin to interfere with how a child may be able to perform in school. How can it interfere? Well, if you have a child who can't concentrate, who's having flashbacks or preoccupied with a traumatic event they've experienced, or is afraid to walk home, is jumpy when a friend walks up behind them, avoid schools and other places that may be re-traumatizing to them. How can it be any surprise to any of us that this can affect how a child performs in school? So let's talk about specifically what we know about how these events and experiences affect children's academic achievement. Study after study, I'm just going to touch on a couple here. Exposure to trauma and violence is associated with decreased IQ and reading ability in elementary school students. It's directly associated with more suspensions and expulsions at elementary, middle, and high school level. It's directly associated with more days absent from school. Lower grade point average, decreased high school graduation rates, okay? So while many of us, and I'm a clinician, think about the clinical experience and symptoms that these children experience, these are things that directly interfere with the mission of educators to address the needs to meet their goal, right? And directly associated with trauma and violence exposure. So now let's talk a little bit about trauma-informed schools. And I would argue to you, and I may be preaching to the choir here, that schools are ideal settings for helping children who've experienced trauma and violence. So let's talk about why. One, that's where kids are. And so by thinking through how do we help schools to meet the needs of these children, we can be able to deliver supports to help these kids in a way that many of our other systems can't. So let me just draw on one example. There was a study after Katrina that compared CBITS, Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, versus TFCBT, which is one of the most evidence-based interventions that are delivered in clinics for kids exposed to trauma. What did they learn? Kids who went through those programs, at the end, the impact of the programs was comparable. In terms of clinically helping kids with PTSD, they were equally effective. But the kids who were randomly assigned to the CBITS program, 90% of them completed the program. The kids assigned to TFCBT, it was less than 20%. Folks, we can't help our kids if they're not coming into sessions. Okay? So it reduces barriers. It reduces stigma. Schools can play a key role. Some people will argue, but this isn't school's mission. School's mission is about education. I'd refer you to the last slide. We know that these experiences interfere with school's mission. If school's mission is truly to educate students, and they're not cognizant in addressing some of these things, they're ignoring factors that greatly prevent a number of students from being able to learn. Now, I'm going to take an aside here because I do think one thing about talking on a child maltreatment, and I'm going to talk a little about CBITS later, and many of the programs that are out there that are evidence-based are group programs. And so one of the questions we have is, well, what about kind of a child who has been sexually abused? And one of the exclusions from the programs we've developed is that, for a child to talk about sexual abuse in a group at school with students that they're likely going to be sitting in math class with 2 periods later probably isn't appropriate. Okay? So let's be clear that these things I'm going to talk about are not silver bullets. They're not for everyone. But at the same time, I will tell you from our initial studies, and many of you know this, that for so many of our children, it's not just a single traumatic event. They have multiple traumatic events to choose from. So many children who've had that experience of sexual abuse also have other experiences of trauma and violence exposure. And one of the things we've learned from many of the programs that I'm going to touch on a little bit later is they're about developing skills. They're about helping children develop skills to be able to better address these experiences in terms of community violence or multiple types of violence. And one of the things that we've learned from our studies, and I can show you the JAMA paper, is that these interventions, they seem to generalize. So if a child is able to learn these skills and apply it to having witnessed a shooting in their neighborhood or witnessed someone being bullied and beaten up, they can take those skills and apply it to other traumatic events, such as physical abuse, such as sexual abuse. It's about skills, and skills generalize. And I think the other thing that's important to remember is, again, if you look at some of the work we've done, they generalize not in a way that only helps you address past traumas, but a lot of the work we're doing was with kids from South Central LA. These kids are exposed to traumatic events on an ongoing basis. And even after the program stopped, we saw symptoms continue to go down over a period of months, which really suggests that these kids are learning skills that help them not only in terms of past traumas, but to be more resilient in place of future traumas. The last thing I'd like to do is let's get back to this argument about schools and education. And one of the things I often hear is, well, that's great, but where are all the studies that show that these types of programs really can help academic achievement? And I will share with you that not only our study, which has shown that CBITS helps kind of grades in academic achievement, but there are over 40 studies of secondary, tertiary prevention school-based behavioral health programs that have academic achievement as an outcome. There are actually far more programs in terms of primary prevention studies that have academic achievement as an outcome. I'm a researcher. Would I like to say it's 400 rather than 40? Sure. I think there should be far more. That said, I would challenge many of our educational colleagues to turn to many of the interventions that are being put in place in schools to achieve better academic outcomes. And how many studies can they point to? Can they point to that same number of studies showing those types of benefits? So yes, we need more research. We need to understand more. But let's not throw shade here, right? This is probably as good, or in some cases better, than we may have for other things that schools are doing to help kids. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Let's talk about what a trauma-informed school is. And so here I'm going to actually pull from a federal definition of what is a trauma-informed system. And it really focuses on 4 things. It realizes the prevalence of impact and trauma in the individuals it's serving. It recognizes those signs of trauma and the need that children who have experienced these events may need additional supports in terms of, in the context of schools, those are learning supports. It responds to trauma with developmentally appropriate support. So we hear about programs, and again, you'll hear me sort of, as I go on, paint a picture. Support can take many different forms, and those forms can change over time for any particular student. And it resists re-traumatization by integrating sort of these principles of trauma-informed in the culture and climate of the school. And it really not only responds, but supports self-care and the other things that need to happen so that everyone within a school, the students, but not just the students, the teachers and administrators, can all be better prepared to kind of address some of the challenges that come up with kind of exposure to trauma and violence. So I'll get to sort of programs and details later, but I would actually argue that there's some sort of foundational principles, foundational beliefs that really should underlie any type of trauma-informed system, and I would argue this is true for trauma-informed schools. Safety. It's silly to talk about being trauma-informed and responding to the needs of students without at the same time being active and aggressive in ensuring people in that environment feel safe. And that may vary from community to community, place to place, student to student, teacher to teacher. There needs to be trust and transparency across all involved. You've heard talk about collaboration. The bedrock of collaboration is trust. And so as we think about the organization and those who it serves, we really think about how do we make decisions about how to help everyone together in a way that builds that type of trust. Peers are critically important. You've heard a lot of talk about the importance of adults, but at the same time, and this is part of changing the culture and climate, kids spend time with other kids. We need to make sure that they act in a way that really can help to support the recovery and healing of others. And that's true for teachers and faculty and administrators too. Collaboration and mutuality. This is not top-down. There are lots of different people involved, and they bring their own experiences. And really, decision-making in schools needs to be meaningfully shared as we think about how schools can help to address this problem. And again, let me emphasize, this may be very different in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, in schools in different communities, serving different populations. It may be different, but this is a foundational principle. Empowerment. Let's recognize that there are populations who have been disenfranchised, who have felt disempowered by the schools and the educational system. And if we're really going to talk about trauma and helping trauma and historical trauma, we really need to bring many of these voices who may have been outside into our communities to participate in the school setting with us. And I think we need to finally recognize that different cultures, different communities perceive these events very, very differently. And I think we have to proceed with due humility that my experience is very different than the experience of all of you in this room. And it is only working together and through collaborating that we can really talk about what a trauma-informed school is. So these are foundational principles. I haven't talked about programs, I haven't talked about specifics. This, in my mind, is sort of the bedrock that underlies everything that we want to do. So what is a trauma-informed school? A trauma-informed school, I would argue, is a structure of a range of programs or interventions for traumatized students. And yesterday, one of our colleagues referred to Catherine Bradshaw, and I'm going to steal an analogy I heard her use the other week. If we think about computer, oftentimes we've heard about kind of this program or this particular intervention, and you can think about it as sort of the program or application on your computer. Is it Word? Is it Excel? Is it PowerPoint? I would argue that a trauma-informed school is actually the operating system. It's the system underlying that provides a structure for this entire range of support and services across a variety of intensities. Many of you are familiar with this. On the educational side, you've seen response to intervention. It's the same pyramid. Any of you who've worked in public health have seen this pyramid, right? And so you have some ways of thinking about this that are universal, that apply to everyone throughout the school. Some that are targeted at students who are at greater risk, and then really selected or clinical interventions really targeted at kids with the greatest need. And really, I think the way to think about this operating system, this structure, is it's built to facilitate the 4 R's that we talk about: the realization of trauma, the recognition, responding to it, and resisting to it. It's this structure that the various programs and pieces that are appropriate and relevant for your schools and your communities in which it can be placed. The last thing is, oftentimes as I talk to people, and it's like, okay, well, this is great. For this particular kid, where does he go in this? And I think it's critically important to remember that over time, kids move. Hopefully most move down where they need less intensive services. Quite honestly, some move up that they will need more intensive services at times, and then back down. And so this is the environment through which we can think about those types of ranges and supports that we need to support students. Okay, so let's talk about universal interventions, and this is sort of for everyone. And so I would suggest sort of a couple goals as we think about what do we want as we think about a trauma-informed school at this level. One, and I think a really nice way I've heard it described, is to help teachers and others in school see things through a trauma lens. Not what did you do and how do I need to respond to it, but what have you experienced that may have caused you to act that way? And you've heard others talk about this, and I really think the idea of helping people see their students through this trauma lens is a really nice way of thinking about it. Why is a student responding a particular way before you react? Before you put in place a consequence, right? Thinking through so you can sort of have that perspective. And that relies on realizing and recognizing symptoms of trauma and understanding how it affects the brain. It also requires all adults in schools, teachers, guidance counselors, social workers, administrators, to be skillful in their interactions with traumatized students. That doesn't mean they're therapists, but it does mean that by understanding that this is how a student is reacting, that you can respond to that in a way that is sensitive to their experience. And I think this is particularly important. Many of you have heard of increasing attention of the school-to-prison pipeline, right? That's language that is familiar to so many of you, and we keep hearing about it. And increasingly, we see attention to giving school police, school resource officers, the skills so they can use trauma-informed discipline and policing strategies in their interactions with students. What about targeted interventions? Well, as I said, these are really interventions targeted at students who are at risk. And so here it really does require more education for those students about trauma, signs, and impact, so they understand what they're going through is for many children what others experience. They're not going crazy. This is a normal reaction, and there are ways to help them. A lot of that is really, you hear me talking about skills. And a lot of it is helping them to master skills for self-regulation,